You're very welcome to our event today, which is part of Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership, leading action on tackling climate change across Cumbria. And we're committed to a net zero goal of 2037. The partnership is made up of more than 80 diverse organisations, including those from businesses, communities, local authorities and the education sector. And the focus on circular economies, which is our focus today, supports the partnership's work on emission reduction plans and actions, particularly the sector group on consumption, waste and circular economy. So we'll hear a little bit more about that in a moment. We've got a great lineup of speakers today, and we really value all of their time and expertise in contributing to the event. And we'll be looking at the principles of circular economies and also the relevance to responding to the climate crisis. And we'll have some case studies of how circular economics is already being applied or plans to apply it here in Cumbria. There'll be opportunities to take questions, so please do use the Q&A tab, which is at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And you're also very welcome to use the chat function for any introductions and comments. Just before we start, I was just reading that our global footprint is currently around 1.5 times the Earth's total capacity to provide renewable and non-renewable resources. And if everybody lived as we do here in the UK, we'd need around 2.5 Earths. So I'm sure Peter may say a little bit more about those kind of concerns and how we'll respond in a moment. But first of all, I'd like to hand on to Councillor Judy Fillmore from the Westmoreland and Furness Council, who's going to say a little bit about the sector group work under the Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership. So Judy, thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Yes, I'm Judy Fillmore. I'm a Green Party councillor, the only one in Westmoreland and Furness Council, and I currently chair the Consumption, Waste and Circular Economy sector group on behalf of Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership. So we are a very lively group. We have increased our meetings recently because the carbon zero emission reduction plan is absolutely needed as soon as possible. So we have been meeting more regularly, and we have been meeting in person for long hours at a time. So thank you to all those people who get involved, because they are volunteers and they come along and spend their time and energy looking at consumption, waste and circular economy. I would say that we have made some good progress, but I think circular economy is definitely something we need to look at some more. So I really welcome this opportunity today to look at that in much more detail. And thank you for CAFS for putting it on. Thanks.
Thanks, Judy. That's great, just to help us understand the context here. Now, when I was planning out today's webinar, then I did find that circular economics was a somewhat amorphous concept. You might understand it's kind of in vague terms what it meant, but to actually pin it down into what it means in practice and how we might apply it has been a challenge. So I'm really pleased to welcome Peter Lefort here from the Green Futures Network. And Peter leads their work on developing collective approaches to the climate and ecological emergencies and the changes that they're bringing. So I think he's definitely the right man to explain all this and put it into context for us. So Peter, big welcome, and I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, and thank you for having me. Yeah, my name's Peter. I run the Green Futures Network at the University of Exeter, which is all about making the latest climate research more accessible and more impactful for businesses, governments, communities around the UK and beyond. Slight caveat before I start, I'm just on the back end of COVID, so apologies, my voice is a bit gruff. Hopefully I'll make sense, and I might need to mute and cough a little bit, so just getting that clarity out of the way. So my brief is to talk a bit about the principles of the circular economy, and then start to look at the impacts, positive and negative, on both the climate and ecological crises and also the just transition that we need. And then I think we'll have time for questions after that. So I've got some slides to go through. I'll just load them up. And when talking about the circular economy, I think it's helpful to first define it by what it's not, or what it's a counterpoint to, and that is the idea of a linear economy. And when I talk about economy, you don't have to be an economist to understand that. I'm not an economist. What we're talking here in practice is around materials and the process of materials being produced and turned into things that we use. That might be food, it might be clothing, anything you like. And this is a model of the linear economy. So this was the dominant way of understanding how the material economy worked for a very, very long time. So we start on the left, we extract that resource. Maybe it's something that's mined in the ground or something that's grown on a tree, for example. We produce the thing, we distribute it, we consume it, we use it, and then we dispose of it, we get rid of it. And that is a lot of the way we had traditionally been thinking about the use of materials. More simply, there's also, you can put it in a model of take, make, and waste. So that's the really, really simple view that has traditionally was quite dominant. And this is, we now know, recognizes, is very flawed, and it's based on a series of quite flawed assumptions. And I'll list a few of them here. One is that we have an infinite pool of stuff that we can take from, whether that's stuff to be mined or stuff to be grown, that will never run out. So that left-hand side of the model is pulling from an infinite pool. We know that that is not the case. Secondly, that the other side of the line is also infinite, that the Earth can infinitely regenerate itself, and we can just dispose of stuff, get rid of it, and that will be fine. And the Earth will be able to cope with all of that waste that is created. And then a third assumption that is absolutely not the case is that the input and the output here are unconnected. When you write things in a linear way, it makes the implication that the beginning and the end are very, very different places. But of course, we know that nothing really in the world operates in that way, and everything is connected. So that begs the question then, okay, well, what is the relationship between the input here, which is resource extraction, and the output, which is disposable, just getting rid of stuff? So let's start to try and pull that into a bit of a circle. And what we're left with is this gap where we know something's going on, but these are generally things that we don't look at, particularly in Western societies. We don't have to look at what happens, what the relationship between taking stuff and getting rid of stuff. But the reality is there are a lot of uncomfortable negative impacts that come as a result of this approach to thinking about stuff. And those impacts are on the climate and ecological crises, and they're also on injustice at a global level, but also at regional and local levels as well. So to really understand what is going on, we need to really dig into this in a little bit more detail. Very broadly, we can think about, well, why is this model so dominant? And there are a few good reasons for this. Part of it is it's a very profitable model. There's a lot of parts of this system that make people a lot of money. Taking stuff out of the ground or wherever the resource extraction might come from is a very profitable enterprise. Moving stuff around so everybody can get what they want. You think of some fairly well-known large companies named after long rivers that might come to mind. And then as well, disposal is a very expensive action, predominantly for local government. And therefore, for someone, it's very profitable as well. So there are these parts of the system that are really hard to shift because we've created so much infrastructure around them. So if we want to start thinking about, well, what's the alternative to this linear model? Let's try and get rid of some of those more complicated bits and look at what's the essence of what we're talking about. And the essence of the circular economy is this. Let's move it from a linear process to one that is a loop. And the core ingredients of this are the production of things, the consumption or use of those things, and then resourcing, so that we're not sourcing new materials and we're not getting rid of the old materials, we're resourcing them so that cycle can go round and round. And you may be very familiar with common images of the circular economy, which all look something like this. These are just ones I found on the internet that you can have a look at. And they all have this very nice, neat, simple circular model. So this idea that things aren't coming in or out of this system. It's a closed loop and it's going round and round, and in theory could go on forever. So that's the very basic principle of it. And now, why is this useful? Why is this important? And maybe what are some of the limitations of this circular economy model, or how do we interrogate it a little bit more deeply? And to do this, I want to share this cartoon, which I find very apt, which speaks to this idea that as human beings, we're very, very good at being in our little box and thinking that things are very simple and linear. If we're at A and we do this thing, then we'll get to B. Great, job done, and we can all go home. But what tends to happen is sometimes we open that door to that box and we realize that the real world is not quite that simple. It's not quite that linear. Things don't happen the way we necessarily think that they do. And this can be a real challenge, because coming to terms with this is a very difficult process. It can be very overwhelming. It can feel disempowering. Well, if everything is so complex, how can we possibly do anything? But if we are to actually have a positive impact on the world around us, globally and locally, then we need to start understanding this. So this is where the circular economy idea comes in. And what you can start to think of this as is a way of trying to move beyond the oversimplified linear idea of how we use stuff, and a nod to the reality of the really complex system that we are a part of, but still trying to make it understandable. So it's not this chaotic map of trying to look at every single part of the system, but it's starting to acknowledge the way things are interrelated. The way we produce affects the way we consume, which affects the way we produce. And these things affect each other. And that's a really important part of the way we need to be looking at the world. So coming back to this idea, how do we then start to make this more representative of what's going on, so we can actually understand and reduce our negative impacts, but also not so complicated that it's overwhelming and we don't know what to do? So we can start by trying to minimize the things that are the most problematic in this process. Resource extraction, distribution, disposal. How do we minimize those things and therefore minimize the negative impacts on these systems that we depend on? And the way we do that is really bringing in this missing chunk, which is regeneration. So regeneration can be recycling, it can be reuse. It's anything where we start to link the end of this process back to the beginning. So whatever we've done in that process of consumption, we link it back to the process of production. And this is the essence of the circular economy. And we can go more and more complicated into this if we want to. So here is an image from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who do fantastic work around the circular economy. Would very recommend looking at their resources. But what they've got here is a much more complicated version of that system. And I've just sort of highlighted how it relates to the model that I've just been using. Let's take a little bit of a closer look. What this is showing the circular economy, but you can see it's much more complicated than that quite simple just diagram of a circle with things going around. The reality of the circular economy is more complicated than that. And there are three parts of this that I want to just highlight in this opening talk. One, which is this part of collection. So here we can see collection is a totally new part of the system that wasn't in the linear economy at all. This is the idea that once we've used a thing, once that consumption has happened, there's going to be something there that is left, and instead of being thrown away, that is collected and used because it is recognized as a valuable resource. So we're adding new bits into this process. Another thing is there's not just one way of doing this. There are hierarchies. Many of you might be familiar with the waste hierarchy, of which recycling is actually the bottom because it's the most intensive, the bottom above just getting rid of something. So you can see here, maintain or prolong, represented by that the tool image, or fixing something, is the top of that hierarchy. So that is the thing which, once we've gone through consumption or use, if we fix that thing, then that circle is much, much smaller than if we focus more on reuse or redistribution or refurbishment or remanufacturing or recycling. So as we get out on that circle, you can see they loop back into higher up parts of the process. So there's more energy that is required to bring those things back to items, food, whatever it is, things that we can use. So hierarchies are a really important part of this process. It's not linear. There are lots of different things that we can do, and they might each have different impacts. And then the last key point here is this idea of leakage. So leakage is the idea that it's not a closed loop system. It's not contained. There is always going to be something that comes out of that cannot be reused. And the term here is leakage. It's also, how does this seep into other parts of the system? What are the other impacts it might have cascading away? So to just get into then, okay, what are the impacts? What are what does this mean for the crises that we are facing? I just wanted to give some example ideas. So thinking about the climate and ecological crises, in terms of impacts, the circular economy has a much reduced carbon footprint to just the idea of getting rid of stuff, throwing it away. Obviously, we have to make less stuff if we're repurposing it, if we're fixing it. So there's a huge carbon benefit to that work. There's also a reduction in deforestation. We have to grow less stuff, or we have to get less virgin materials, and that has huge ecological benefits as well as carbon benefits. And similarly, if we're throwing away less stuff, there's going to be less pollution, which again has massive benefits on the ecosystem. However, there's still leakage within this system. So there's still, for example, downstream impacts, which is the idea that everything we do has an impact further down the line, and we have to draw a boundary around something to understand it, but we need to not ignore what is happening further away. For example, a paper bag, for instance, when we recycle paper bags, they actually take more water to recycle than they do to create fresh ones. And so that's not saying that we shouldn't do it, because there are other implications, but we need to be aware of what are those impacts further down the line. Secondly, it still requires raw materials. There are some things we cannot repurpose and we cannot recycle. So this is not fixing the problem. There are still things that we need to be taking out of the ground. And it's still a profit-driven process. This is still operating on, we want more stuff, let's have more stuff. And all of the implications that come from profit-driven enterprise, which are very, very useful in a lot of conditions, but also problematic in many others, are relevant here. And then let's think about then the just transition, so social impacts and social justice. One positive here is that there's more of an emphasis on human beings and jobs as part of this process than resources themselves. We can value the people and the jobs, people who are doing the work in repurposing and bringing those resources back into use, more so than just getting more and more resources themselves. Secondly, modular design, which is the idea of things being designed so they can be easily fixed, taken apart. You don't have to throw the whole thing away like a mobile phone. It's cheaper for people, so that's making things more accessible. And then lastly, there are much stronger policies for governments to apply on circular economy processes and a much tighter control on where those benefits and where those negatives might sit that can come both locally and globally, which is a huge positive. And then onto the leakage side, again, there's downstream impacts. An example here might be the idea of ownership. So as resources become more valuable, who is owning those resources becomes more and more of a bone of contention. So is that going to increase injustice locally or somewhere else in the world if the value of these items becomes greater? Secondly, the waste still needs to be handled. Who is handling that waste? It often falls to people who are not very well paid, not very well supported, and some of this stuff can be quite toxic and dangerous. And then lastly, there are still governance issues here. Who decides what is part of the circular economy? Who decides how these things are being used and who gets to do that work? So there are still justice issues here around how this economy functions in practice. Last thing I wanted to say before any questions is this idea that the circular economy is really, really important, but it's not the end. As Nigel said at the very beginning, we know we're operating outside of our safe planetary boundaries, which is represented by this image here from the Stockholm Resilience Centre. We're overshooting our safe operating space for a habitable planet. So the reason we've got to this is because we've had degenerative systems. So these are systems that take more than they give. And the linear economy is an example of that. And often the circular economy is talked about as a sustainable alternative, and sustainable here being about balance. So we're taking as much as we're giving. But we know really that the circular economy is not inherently sustainable. It's much better, but it's still inherently degenerative because there's still things coming out and there's still things going in. And we can't really change that. We can't get to a perfect system. So what we need alongside the circular economy is more regenerative systems to change this image on the left and to make sure that we're giving more than we are taking. So the reason I share this just to finish is to think about, we absolutely need to move much, much closer to the circular economy, but at the same time, we also need to think about what else can change and how do we have more regenerative systems beyond this? So can we change consumption itself, the very essence of needing things in the first place, because that's much more effective than the circular economy, just using less stuff. And business models, can we change those as well? So just as the linear economy, we need to look at it as a system to look at the circular economy. As we look at the circular economy, we also need to look at the wider system of everything we're doing in the way we are living on our planet. Hopefully that was a useful overview, and I'll stop sharing my slides.
Thanks very much, Peter. That was excellent. It was really insightful, really thought-provoking, and to me it was very clear. So the fact that you said you were not an economist, I think probably was a benefit in this case. That to have this explained by a non-economist, I think was probably all to the good. So thank you very much, and I'm very pleased that the just transition element of this is there as well, because that's something that the Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership is committed to make sure it isn't just purely a carbon accounting exercise to cut emissions, but there are real people, real livelihoods involved. And obviously it is a global challenge as well. So we want to make sure that we're not excluding or disadvantaging people in this transition. So we're going to have a few minutes now for some questions. I think there's a couple have come in. Anna, would you possibly be able to help us by fielding questions, please?
Yeah, John has asked, are you aware of any quantified emission savings from the circular economies compared with linear economies?
Yeah, great question, John. Yeah, not off the top of my head, I can't give any data, but a quick search online will probably give you that. There are lots of examples of those because it's quite easy to track if you're not creating something new, but you're repurposing it or recycling it. There are lots of quite good ways of measuring the carbon savings of those. Again, they don't necessarily always capture the whole breadth of emissions, like life cycle emissions or scope 3 emissions. So it's not a simple answer, but it's clear enough that there are large carbon benefits from a lot of examples here. And I'd be happy to try and find some and share some afterwards if that was useful.
And the second question, how do we get info on all the aspects of recycling versus totally different products, for example, using rice packaging rather than foam?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the simple answer is it's not always that easy to do because who you're getting the data from is going to affect what the data says. And I think some things, again, are more complicated. So that example of if you've got packaging that is edible versus packaging that is disposable or the packaging that's biodegradable, though they're very, very different waste streams that those things might go into. They might also impact on our own consumption of food or what happens in the local ecosystem. Is that thing going to end up in the water? So there are so many moving parts to that system. It's very difficult to be exact about it. But what I think a good starting point is really thinking about what are all of the potential implications of these different choices. And it's not just carbon. There are lots of other things. Who's going to be impacted locally? Who's going to be impacted globally? And it's an invitation to really think about your impact in a broad and holistic sense.
Okay, thank you, Peter. That's all really helpful. I'm just going to invite Nigel Curry and then Tim Keane, who've got questions they'd like to put or comments verbally. So I'll start with Nigel. Hopefully you can ask your question.
Thanks very much, Nigel. Peter, you kind of hinted without saying it towards the end of your talk that the circular economy is pretty closely aligned to no economic growth, or even part of the anti-growth agenda. Would you like to expand a bit more on that and what it means in terms of employment, jobs and wealth?
Thanks, Nigel. Yeah, if different people you ask, my view of the circular economy is not that it's anti-growth, that it's growth agnostic, that it acknowledges that growth is going to happen sometimes and it's not going to happen other times. And an economy that is based on infinite growth is quite literally insane and not going to work on the planet on which we live. So there are many ways you can apply circular economy models, but I think it needs to be regenerative, and being regenerative means that growth is going to happen sometimes, and decay or collapse or whatever language you want to use is also going to happen at other points, which is very easy to see in some natural systems like food systems, for example. But you can look at other models like donut economics, I think, which go into the relationship between growth and prosperity in a lot more detail.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to come to Tim Coombe now.
Yeah, I think I'm there. Thank you very much. That was a really good overview. I really enjoyed that. The Cumberland Authority have stated as their top aim is health and well-being in the council. And I came across a couple of days ago a very interesting series of articles by the Green Alliance on the link between climate issues and health and well-being, and it struck me that is actually another type of circular economy. Is that something that you've been actively studying? Because it seems to me that might be a way into getting unlocking support, because everything that they do will need to have a health and well-being emphasis. Yeah,
absolutely, brilliant point. As it is another form of circular economy, for sure. Health and well-being is something that we treat in quite a linear way traditionally, as that's hospitals, that's doctors, and that's over there. But clearly the inputs and the outputs of the health economy affect everything. And it's a really good example of the idea of leakage, the fact that if that system isn't working properly, it's going to impact all of these other systems. People aren't going to go to work. They're not going to be consumers. They're not going to be able to support their own families if that health system is not functioning. So the circular economy, I think that's a really good invitation to look at the circular economy in pretty much every system. It's about looking at how all of these systems are interconnected, and how the place that we need to get to, the safe operating space for humanity and for the planet, requires a regenerative approach to all of these systems that are impacting each other. And the more we look at them as linear, separate things, the more negative impacts and unintended consequences are going to arise.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I think the complexity and the interconnectivity of all of this is a point well made. Absolutely. I know you've got to leave us very shortly. Have you got time to take one more question, please? Oh, Peter, brilliant. Thank you. So Anna, there is another question in the Q&A if you'd like to go to that one, please.
Yeah, sure. Laura asks, we tend to think about the circular economy with regards to material goods, but how about food production? Can we reach a circular model of food production, particularly of livestock? Do you have any links to resources about thinking about this?
Thanks, Laura. I'll have a think about resources and share them if I can find any. But yes, absolutely, food can come within the circular economy model as well. And it's a good example of sometimes it's easier to think about that because you have food waste. You can see it turning into compost, going into soils, being the thing that more food comes from. So it's much easier to conceptualize for people as a circular system. It's also easy to look at that and think, well, it's not perfectly circular. We still need energy to go into that. That energy is coming from the sun a lot of the time, which is sort of regenerative, but also, you know, at some point the sun will die. We probably don't need to worry about that for another few millennia, but it's another, you know, example of these systems aren't purely circular. They still need some input. They still need some output. So we still need to be regenerative. But food systems, I think, are a really nice example of of how things can be more circular and how they naturally are more circular. And one thing I'd recommend looking at is permaculture principles as a nice way into that way of thinking.
Thank you, Peter. In fact, that connects really well to a presentation we've got in the second half from my colleague, Ro Baker from CAFS, who's going to talk about vermiculture. So vermiculture is a completely new one for me, and I'm really keen to find out more. So we'll look forward to that. But again, Peter, many thanks for your time, for joining us from Cornwall, and we really appreciate your clear introduction and explanation of what a circular economy is. So thank you.
Having me, Kyle.
Okay, so we do have an opportunity for some more questions in the second half after our next presentations, but I'm going to hand on to Ian Hind, who's a policy officer at Cumberland Council, and Ian's going to talk about opportunities for circular economics in a local authority context. So Ian, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I've kind of got that sort of feeling of, follow that, but I'll try. So I'm just going to, no, I'm not quite about to, am I going to share screen? Sorry, I'm trying to do this from here. So let me, now you
see that, Ian? Yes, that's great. I can see that. Thank you.
Jolly good. Now, there we go. So as a way of introduction and to some extent to follow up what Pete's just been saying, I think I'm going to cover a couple of aspects that councils can look at their work around, and just to caveat that with the fact that I'm not an expert on either, but I'm doing this presentation this afternoon, so just bear that in mind. The first one is procurement, in the sense that we have some ability to influence what goes on locally. Now, our procurement team, there's a voice coming from somewhere. Our procurement team is referring to this as being social value, in terms of being able to use the money that we spend to get better value for the community, for the benefits for the community, etc. So, and the priorities around that are running through social, economic, environmental, and excellent public services. I don't know how clearly you can see those. Depends on, I suppose it depends on the size of your screen, but hopefully you can get the gist of that. And the idea being that we get the best value out of every pound. Don't read that as being something special that we've invented called the Cumberland pound. It just means the pound that we're spending. And so the theme that the procurement team are looking to promote across colleagues who are procuring goods and services is that we must all own this notion. And I think that a lot of the things that Peter's talked about are within that, but it may not be being referred to as a circular economy as such, partly because from where we started, that it's still a term that people don't fully understand. The second part is a couple of projects shared with Westmoreland and Furness, and this first one is about the reuse and repair of aids for daily living, as it says. So here are some examples of the kind of things that people are given usually after a hospital stay, or perhaps just daily needs generally. And these things are not supplied by the health service, by the NHS, although you might imagine that they're coming from the same source, because if you need something like a Zimmer frame or crutches, and then you get some of these as well, that you might think, well, it's all part and parcel of the same thing. It's not. And these things are they don't go back to the health service. So the project has been set up to start and collect these and make sure that they can be either reused or recycled somewhere. Yeah, so the very bottom point there says it started as a 6-month trial, but it went very well. And so now it's continuing. You can take items that are no longer of use to the recycling centres. They are then treated by the contractors and subcontractors and processed for reuse or not. And then they're cooked by the looks of it. So this image, I haven't seen one of these myself. I haven't seen one before, but it says it's called an autoclave. So these things are presumably intensively cleaned, and then they can be reused. So as I say, this is a project we are sharing with Westmoreland and Furness, so it covers the whole of Cumbria. And then what they're doing is recording how much of this equipment is being collected and reused. And so these are some figures taken from the household waste recycling centres in a 12-month period. I think this is across the whole of Cumbria because it says there are 14 there. And as you see, there's a reference to Keswick Library, which will be in Cumberland, and Barrow and Kendal, which are now in Westmoreland and Furness. So it's had a good level of success. Moving on to a current project, which is about the recycling and reuse of waste electrical and electronic equipment. And so this project has just been just getting going, and there are, as it says, collection points in libraries, sports centres, etc., and 2 public take-back events in Carlisle and Whitehaven, with the items being taken to Lily Hall for Cumbria Recycling to reprocess. And through this project, I'm trying to get people to think about how they can contribute their items. And here we've got what I think is probably some national publicity with Garfield's less happy looking cousin, I think, as the pink cat there, and trying to get people to, as it says, material focuses recycle your electricals campaign with the brand messenger of HypnoCat, a mesmerizing pink fluffy cat with hypnotic superpowers. So hopefully this will start appearing around the county, and you'll become familiar with it. So to summarize this, there are collection points around the county. The materials are being prepared. It will be advertised across bins and other places, and the aim is to collect 7,700 items, or 9.36 tons of equipment over the next 6 months. I think that's the last slide. Yes, it is. I'm just going to invite Judy to ask if she wants to say anything from a Westmoreland and Furness point of view, but no is an acceptable answer, I reckon. She's not unmuted.
Okay, I wasn't prepared for this, Ian. So, you know, we have just recently, the sector group has just recently had a visit to the waste centre in Barrow, which was, you know, we had a lot of very interesting questions and a very, you know, thoughtful and provoking visit there, where we were looking in particular at carbon emissions reduction in the future. So that's really all I can mention at the minute. If I'd had a bit more preparation, I'd perhaps be able to say a little bit more. But you know, that I think it is work in progress. We have in the sector group, we do have representation from both Cumberland Council and Westmoreland Furness Council in terms of waste collection officers of various kinds. So we do have that input, which is very gratefully received. Thank you.
I wasn't trying to put you on the spot. I was just giving you the opportunity to cover anything I've missed.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Ian, for giving us that overview, and also Judy for attempting to respond on that at short notice. We have a couple more presentations, and then we're going to have a chunk of time for some questions. I see there's one or two that have come in which you may wish to be thinking about. So Jonathan Powell was asking about whether there's a sort of consistent approach across household waste recycling centres. Because they've been doing some of these things, they're collecting living items at Millham Network Centre. There's also a comment about whether there should be a poster in all GP practices and health centres. And also Karen's asking about any electrical items, whether they're just recycled or whether they can be reused. So we'll come on to those hopefully after we've heard from our other speakers. But I'm already struck by the range of sort of sectors and connections there are with circular economics. So we've heard already about agriculture and about public health. And we're now going to come on and hear from Daniel Holder, who's the managing director at the Quiet site. And he'll give us a business perspective in the hospitality sector. So welcome, Daniel. We look forward to hearing from you. I know you've been on quite a journey on this already.
Thank you very much, Nigel. I'll just start by sharing my screen, hopefully. Can you all see that?
I can see that. Thank you, Daniel. If you'd just like to put it on slideshow mode, and then we're good to go. That's the bottom at the button at the bottom in the center. Yeah, just one to the right, I think.
Perfect.
There we go.
Always learning. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Daniel.
Okay, so hi, thank you very much for inviting me to talk about what we've done to move our business into one that follows a more circular route. Our journey started around 20 years ago. And when I bought the Quiet site, the park occupies an old sheep farm, which dates from the 17th century, and much of the park's infrastructure occupies these ancient buildings. And it's probably worth saying at this point in time that running a holiday park is a little bit like being the mayor of a small town, insofar as you can do things quite quickly and easily without having to ask too many people. And planning department of Cumberland, I hope not listening too closely to that, but you can move reasonably quickly. So hopefully that explains why we've done as much as we have. In 2010, we stopped selling water in plastic bottles, and I think this was probably the easiest and one of the most important things that we ever did. Taking that plastic bottle out of our shop was really like kind of life-changing for us. And as any retailer will tell you, actually, selling water in plastic bottles is one of the most profitable things a shop can do. It's more profitable than selling alcohol, toys, sweets, cigarettes, and of course there's no VAT. And I often think that that's one of the main reasons why there's been a really slow take-up on removing plastic bottles from our society. We installed a free at point of use filtered and chilled water machine at the same time, and we've now got 3 of those, and they're incredibly well used. In 2014, we switched our milk sales from plastic to glass bottles, and we operate a deposit scheme, which is still in use today, and that's really popular, especially with the children. You know, when they bring their bottle back for 20 pence, that's always a fun thing for them to do. And in 2016, we started to install gravity dispensers into our old shop, and that was followed up in 2018. Where we built a dedicated zero waste shop. And with this, we've been able to stock local and ethically sourced items and cut single-use plastic virtually completely from all of our sales in the shop. We've been able to influence guests and our suppliers have actually had to change their work practices or lose us as a customer. In a few short years, I'm sure that single-use plastic will be remembered like tobacco is today. Zero-waste shops are also excellent at reducing food waste. People buy just what they need, and we often see families come in with cereal bowls and filling them with sort of Rice Krispies and cornflakes, and I guess it doesn't get much better than that. Essentially, to a large extent, we're just turning the clock back, I think, 50 years or so. And since I suppose most importantly, since we opened our zero-waste shop, we've seen a drop in our waste by around about 15%. So I think that for me, that's really the most important part. This slide shows, or nearly shows, that it is possible to have 6 recycling bins. There is actually a bin to the right of the paper and card, and contrary to what our present Prime Minister says. But that said, I'm always quite sort of dubious about recycling, and keeping containers to reuse again and again just feels so right. And obviously, following on from what Peter said, that sort of diagram on the right, the circular economy is definitely where we want to be. Right. So in 2021, we introduced a food waste composter that came all the way up from Cornwall, and that's so all the food waste from our food outlet, and also from customers' waste goes into there. The food, and I noticed that this food composter now has been adopted by several other Cumbrian companies. I noticed there's 6 or 7 of them lined up at T-Base Services last week, so that's always really good to see. Okay, so next thing, so we've been building our own accommodation since 2015, and that was really on the back of static caravans by definition. And the way that they're built and the short life that they're expected to have didn't really fit in with what we wanted to do. We wanted to build buildings that could be repurposed and reused in the future, and that's how we've designed our products. They can be repurposed very easily into to different holiday accommodations, or maybe old people's accommodation in the future, or whatever is needed in 50, 100, 200 years time. The fundamental design is such that the repurposing is very easy. And at the end of this month, I'm addressing a trade association actually, to talk about sustainable future of the holiday park industry. And along with energy, biodiversity and transport, I'll be questioning whether we can continue to build the holiday park industry around the short leases of static caravans. After 20 years, a static caravan is essentially worthless, jobless, and very, very difficult to recycle. Our home built accommodations have either PV or green roofs, and the PV roofs actually generate more energy than the accommodation uses, and so they can be described as energy positive, which I think is a perfect result. In 2021, we built this zero waste takeaway. It's an off-grid food outlet, and we serve all of our food on proper china and charge deposits for the cups. Bacon sandwiches, crepes, stone-baked pizza, 364 days a year. The food is delicious, and there's never much food waste, but what there is obviously goes into our food digester. But more importantly, we produce no packaging waste at all. A simple idea that I'm sure can be rolled out to other takeaways in the county. Okay, our on-site bar sells no drinks in plastic at all, and no plastic wrapped snacks, and over 90% of what we sell is on draft is sourced locally, and by locally just a few miles down the road. Running a sustainable business requires a whole team effort in our experience, and it needs the whole team to buy into the ethics of what we're doing, and this has led us to be running a sort of an upside down management structure here. Decisions on the company's direction are decided in regular team meetings, and while I chair these meetings, I'm rarely the one with the best ideas. The team buy-in really leads us to having a secure and motivated team, which often has a waiting list to join. So it's always good to end up on good points and bad points. So a few good points to running a business with circular principles include lower waste and recycling costs, lower food waste, employee buy-in, and being able to influence both our customer base and our supplier chain. The less good bits, the negative bits, include lower profit margins sometimes, especially in the shop. People look in our zero waste shop and they often think it looks empty as they're so conditioned to seeing brand packaging. And we've had to take difficult decisions on not stocking popular but traditional items associated with camping due to the single-use plastic that they have. So in conclusion, what we have done is not complicated. In many ways, it's just like turning the clock back, where waste was not economically viable. For us, operating in a circular economy makes excellent long-term business sense and is a major and underlying part of our drive to be more sustainable as a business. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Wow, Daniel, that was fantastic. Thank you. I really found that inspirational, and I'm struck by what a holistic view you've taken of the operation there at the Quiet Site. So we heard about food and beverage and retail, and the way that buildings are constructed, and the way that energy is generated. So I'm really struck by that, and the opportunities for maybe the ripple effect across other hospitality businesses, or indeed amongst the visitors who come through your site. So really inspiring. Thank you. Just before we come to any questions, I meant to come to our last speaker, Ro Baker from CAFS, who is kindly going to talk about vermiculture. I know nothing about vermiculture, so I'm all ears, keen to learn on this. So I'm just going to share screen on Ro's behalf. Hopefully that's okay, Ro. You can see your slide.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Thanks, Nigel, and thanks, Daniel. That was incredibly inspiring. What a fantastic business. And I'm looking forward to visiting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Vermiculture Cumbria, which is a pilot project that we're running through the low carbon food programme, which ZCCP are funding. We're looking at how vermiculture, which is worm composting and worm farming, can support the farm to fork journey. So that's working with farmers, working with hospitality, working with restaurants, and looking at food waste as well. Next slide, please. So the issues that we're looking at are both the emissions of greenhouse gases. We know that food waste emits methane and nitrous oxide. These gases are 31 and 310 times stronger than carbon dioxide, respectively. RAP, who do a lot of work around food waste, knows that the UK produces 9.52 million tonnes of food waste per year, which emits 25 million tonnes of greenhouse gases. And that is 5.5% of our total national emissions. So it's an absolutely huge issue. And we need to find ways of tackling it. Worm farming is incredibly low tech. Worms are a very humble creature, but they do an absolutely fantastic job. And we know from lots of studies that have been done that they can reduce greenhouse gas emissions significantly because they reduce the volume of food waste that goes into landfill. And in turn, all of that transport to and from landfill, taking and dumping food waste or transporting it to other areas isn't required. So you're also saving on the transport emissions. Next slide, Nigel. In terms of economy, we think it has huge potentials because it's not only beneficial for the planet, but it's also beneficial to our wallets, which is sometimes the carrots that is needed to get people to look at things like composting. The consumable food waste in the UK is £19 billion. which adds to up to £284 per person in the country. We know that the hospitality sector tosses away £3.2 billion worth of food every year, and that households bin £13.8 billion worth of edible food each year, which is quite staggering, and obviously has an impact on people's economy, especially in this time when people's economies are so stretched. So anything that we can do to educate, support people to buy wisely, store wisely, and not throw out food is incredibly valuable. Next slide, Nigel. So for this pilot, we're going to be working with a number of partners. Our consultancy is going to be Anna de la Vega. She works or has set up the Urban Worm CIC. She's a fantastic, dynamic lady who has been all over the world researching the humble worm and what it can do for vermiculture. She's been to the Philippines, to New Zealand, to Thailand, to many places where vermiculture isn't just seen as a home composting. It's a state-run food waste system, which I think is incredibly inspiring, and one that maybe our own councils will possibly need to take up in the future when the cost of food waste disposal becomes higher and higher. We're going to be working with Carbon Calling. Some of you may have heard of that. It's an annual conference that runs each year in Cumbria. It's made up of regenerative farmers from all over the world. They come and they talk about regenerative farming practices and changes that can be made in farming and agriculture. We've got a lot of farmers in Cumbria interested in setting up windrow sites. So a windrow site is an open trench that they simply fill with manure. It can be any manure from the farm. It could be from cows, horses. Manure is apparently really good because it's slightly lower in nitrous oxide. But the point being is that it's an incredibly simple on-farm, in-field way of utilising your farm waste manure, where you simply lay it out in a trench, you add composting worms to it, and in a matter of months, that compost is either ready to be spread on your fields instead of using artificial fertilizers, imported chemicals, or it can be bagged up with the potential for a farmer to sell it on as a peat-free compost. So it has multiple potentials, basically, for whether the farmer wants to use this on his own fields or whether to sell it on. The other thing that farmers can look at is actually worm farming, which is a slightly different process, that they could actually start producing worms to sell on to other composters. We're going to be working with some hospitality outlets. We're going to work with the Westmoreland family at Reghead. They'd like to trial some vermicomposters. So this is a closed loop system, if you like. The process is aerobic, which means it's not anaerobic, it's aerobic, it's open to the air. But the composters that will be hosted at Reghead will be like large bins with ventilation going through them. The food waste comes from the cafe, the garage outlet, and their pie making business at Reghead will go into these units. And we're going to look at how these vermiculture compost units compare to the ones that they've got at T-Bay North that Daniel referred to, which is the Rydan composters. They are a slightly different system. They're a hot composting system. Daniel can probably tell me a lot more about it. I've had a look at them. No, I think Daniel will agree, no composting is 100% easy right at the start. You've got to get your waste composition right. So whichever type of unit you're using, whether it's a hot composter or a vermiculture unit, you need to make sure that you're getting your right mix of greens and browns and liquids and fluids, and how hot is it getting, how cold is it getting, all the rest of it. But once you've sorted that, then you're on your way, basically. I think that the ride-down composters they've got at T-Bay North, if you can imagine the amount of food waste that's coming out of T-Bay North and the amount of staff that have to take the food and put it into the ride-down composters, all of these things have their challenges, including the Cumbrian weather, because they're not directly sited outside the kitchen door. So it's interesting that this big family, the Westmoreland family, have really taken on board the idea of composting to deal with their food waste. That's the first thing. It's fantastic. They're very committed to it. The other thing is that it's really helped them to look at what food waste they are producing in the first place and try to minimize that. So exactly what we were saying about, it's not just about recycling or what do you do with food waste. It's about reducing that food waste in the first place. And then final part of our circle, if you like, our economic circle, is that then we will then use that compost output from Reghead and T-Bay to go onto the growing sites at Low Sizer Farm. And they've also opened a new T-Bay market garden, which will be supplying the salads and vegetables to the T-Bay cafes. So again, they will also have a windrow site, so they'll have a place where they can put manure and their plants from the polytunnels. When they die down, they will go into a windrow site. So we've got from the farm windrow right the way through to the food hospitality, and then back again to the farm or the grower or the community project. So that's the plan, and fingers crossed that we will get there and we'll see how it works. So I think we're on to the final slide, Nigel. That's all right.
Yeah, thank you. You've got just 1 minute left, Ro, if you
Okay.
could complete. Thanks. That would be brilliant.
Next slide. Okay, oh no, maybe 2 slides. So yes, I think I've talked about this. So we're looking at windrow sites, vermicomposting units, and then distributing the surplus. That's the basic principles. Next slide, Nigel. Thank you. So the other thing that we can start looking at once we've done the pilot and see how it works and see what the challenges are, we can look at scaling up. Anna de la Vega already works with shopping malls. She already works with the MOD. She already works in prisons. She already looks at large quantities of business waste, like from Wagamama restaurants and others. I think it's something that councils may be interested in when the changes come in and they have to start for their own doorstep food waste pickup or paying for food waste disposal. So I think there's huge potential to scale it up, but we're going to start small and go from there. That's it. Thank you, Nigel.
Thanks, Ro. That's a really interesting subject I know nothing about. So I was just trying to figure out if that was Carlisle. I don't think it is it, that picture? But great to see the opportunities to scale up across so many sectors potentially. Well, so we've covered so many possible strands and themes to circular economies, what it could mean in different sectors, which has been fascinating. We have got a few questions. There's 1 or 2 in the Q&A. There's possibly 1 or 2 that come out of the chat. And I know, I think Tim Coombe very kindly has been waiting patiently with his hand up. So we'll try and come to you before the end as well, Tim. Thank you. But Anna, have we got some questions in the Q&A or?
I was on mute. Yeah. So Martin asked, our economy is very visitor based and it is often visitors who are using disposable stuff. What opportunities do you envisage to work with providers in the visitor economy, for instance, event organisers, to minimise dependence on disposable stuff?
I guess that's a question to Daniel particularly, is it? But anybody else welcome to come in on that? I mean, just to try and set the context, I know in the Ullswater Valley, for example, there are some mass participation events, and they can have quite an impact sometimes on the valley, and sometimes, unfortunately, there is waste generated. But Daniel, would you like to come in?
Yes, of course. I think certainly that with big events where food is provided for the people at that event, I think there's very little waste actually. I think possibly you're possibly referring to the Ullswater Way has become quite a popular sort of charity walk destination, and yeah, there are issues with litter and waste, and certainly we have a policy here. We pick up litter through our lane, from where it starts to where it ends, and I think probably by the fact that the litter disappears quite quickly, that certainly is something that happens throughout the valley. But yeah, I mean as you probably guessed, I'm a big advocate of zero waste shops, and anything that's zero waste for me is good. But it's one of those things where I prefer to see a few people doing it perfectly, but millions doing it imperfectly. So it's that transition that we're in this at the moment, and getting things economically viable as well as actually physically viable are two different things. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do, but I think the important thing is that we're in transition already. That it has started, and it's just the speed at which we go at obviously is again very much orchestrated by government, central government. How much they bring in, and what they're asking us to do. Without that, I think it's all down to the SEOs. That said, I went to COP26 and I met a couple of government ministers who were hopeless, but I was surrounded by SEOs who were absolutely inspiring. So I think there is a real big move from business to make a change, and that's certainly what I'm seeing throughout our industry. But again, it's all about speed of transition. We're never going to be doing enough quick enough, but it's as long as things are changing, I think that's important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. It certainly looks like you're on a really positive pathway there, and it's been inspiring to see the growth of zero waste shops generally on high streets. And I guess a large hospitality site is a little bit like a large village or even a small town when it's got a lot of people there. So it's really good to see those approaches in a hospitality venue like that. Hannah, was there another question in the Q&A, please?
Yeah, this is for Ro. Just a quick one. Wendy asks, are you working with Cumbria master composters?
So no, not directly. I do know about Cumbrian master composters, and we've got one of the trained master composters who's very interested in looking at the vermiculture project. So I'm certainly going to be inviting him to come along to the workshops if he'd like to get involved, or we can cross-promote the master composting stuff. It's all very open and sort of fluid at the minute. So yes, sort of not officially, but I'd be very happy to.
Oh, great. Thanks very much. I'm sure there's real scope for collaboration there. We have heard from the master composters at a previous event, so doing really inspiring work and supported by the local authorities, I think. So
Fantastic.
I'm going to come to Tim Coombe, who's got his hand up. Tim, would you like to put a question or comment, please?
Yep, it's to Ian Hyde, actually. Going back a little while, but it's really good to see that there's a breakthrough with the small electricals in recycling centres. At our Sustainable Brampton Farmers Market every month, we run something called a give and take stall, which involves people giving stuff that is perfectly good, which they don't need, and we give it away to people who say, oh yes, I'll have that. Now that is done at a small scale, but we get rid of hundreds of items every month at this give and take stall. The same thing could be applied to all recycling centres, and I know it is in other authorities. Is there any chance that Cumberland might actually institute such a thing, that people can take stuff that is good but they don't want or need into a covered area, and that somebody else can come up when they're getting rid of their recycling waste and seeing something that they want and take it away? I think it's the embedded carbon content of previously manufactured goods, which is a huge amount of carbon saving because it's not going into landfill. Have you got any comment on that, Ian?
I haven't got a direct answer for you, but I'm going to tell you that, you know, you are not speaking to somebody who's got deaf ears on this one. I had the same thought myself. In fact, I was talking to my colleague who manages the waste service the other day about exactly this. My other bugbear being the people who leave their cars running while they're sitting waiting to access the household waste recycling centres. But apart from that, some of the issue is the lack of space in which to situate exactly what you're talking about. But they have got the message and they are thinking about it. And I don't think there's much more detail than that at the moment.
No, it's just sowing the seed.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Ian. Wendy, you've got a question or a comment?
I was one of the first people to train as a Cumbria master composter. Cumbria contracted this to Garden Organic, and Frankie and Rachel, who are the respective WAF and Cumberland organisers, they're paid by Garden Organic, and they support us with resources, leaflets and all that sort of thing, and backup and meetings. But I would say that generally Cumbria master composters don't get much support, or haven't up till now, from where I am, South Lakeland. South Lakeland sort of say, oh, it's lovely, we've got you. But I think there's got to be more coming from the two new councils to actually encourage us in things. We do loads of stuff and we go to loads of events and have demonstration sites around the county, but all our encouragement is from the Garden Organic team and not directly from the council. And I'd like to see more of this, because we've been going for quite a few years.
Thank you, Wendy. And I think we all recognise the great work that's being done by the Garden Organic and Master Composters. Absolutely. We haven't got much time, but I think that's maybe a challenge laid down to Ian and Judy and your wider organisations as to how local authorities can continue to support that work.
Nigel, can I just ask a supplementary question to that, back to Wendy? What have you got in mind there? Because I can't tell when you're saying we go to all these events, etc., but we would like some more support. What is that?
Advertising us, putting us on websites and posting about us. I've just recently started community composting at Staveley School, which is between Kendal and Windermere. But it was all our own effort. There's nobody behind any of these things. And there's going to be a site at Queen Catherine School in Kendal for compost demonstrations. But none of the telling about this comes from the councils as such, or the councillors. They don't turn up at these things. And although people like Giles, who's very pro-eco and everything, knows of us and is behind us, they don't just get involved in any way. They don't publicise us, and I think they should be doing that.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy, for sharing that. And I think it is really important, something maybe we can take forward after this if there are opportunities for the local authorities to do more to support that work. So really important that you raised that. Thank you. We are almost out of time. I know in the chat, Jonathan Powell had also mentioned the value of composting in schools. So thank you for that feedback, Jonathan. There's another question we may not get to today, unfortunately, but Nigel Curry's asked about do people perceive much of a change in the dominant central and local government model of linear growth-based economies? Unfortunately, we can't solve that one in a minute, Nigel, but one thing I am really interested in is when you look at the solutions to the climate crisis, and quite a lot of them involve things like renewables and like batteries and so on, and just making sure we're not going to potentially repeat the mistakes of the past in racing around using precious metals and then not having a way of reusing those materials. So I think, as was said at the very start, we need to be focusing on our consumption rather than thinking that the circular economy is a way out of all of this. Other than that, thank you very much for all of the questions and comments. Apologies if we didn't get to one or two of them at the end. We have got another event coming up after this, which is on boosting repair and reuse, and that's on the 28th of November. So some of the points around electricals and community repair schemes and so on, I'm sure we'll be raising those there for those that are interested. We also have a visit to the Renew Hub, which is coming up on the 30th of November. And the Renew Hub is a really inspiring reuse project in Greater Manchester between local authority and the third sector. And I think it would be really inspiring to go and see that, and opportunities maybe to replicate elements of that here in Cumbria, building on one of the questions. Other than that, I'd just like to say a huge thanks again to all of our contributors, to Peter, who left earlier, and to everybody who is still on the screen here. Thank you for all of the ideas and the inspiring presentations that you gave us. And it's really fascinating to see how circular economies manifest themselves in so many ways around society and around business and so on, and real scope to do so much more on this. So thank you very much. But thank you, and we'll finish there.